coordinating that. That's excellent. No other announcements, Steve?
Nope.
All right, great. We'll begin with prayer and then we'll jump in. Father, thank you for this chunk of scripture. And again, I just pray as we work through it, hopefully this week and the next week, however that turns out, Lord, that again, we see our world through your word. I ask that in your son's name. Amen.
Amen. Amen.
All right, so we're now into this next Toledot, the Toledot of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Again, what is unique about this, just looking at that?
There are three people versus just one.
That's right. It's the Toledot of the triplets. I'm just going to keep throwing that out there until people believe it, right? But yeah, there are two Toledots that stand out that are very different. Esau gets two. These guys are lumped as a unit and stuff like that, right? And in this, there are two units in this Toledot. The Table of Nations and the dispersion of those nations, or the Tower of Babel. Now again, the units are not chronologically presented to us, they're thematically put to us. And of course what we're doing, what the literary approach is setting this up so that when God calls Abraham, we find him at the crossroads of humanity, right there on the coast of the Mediterranean. Exodus 19:5-6 says, "Now then, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own possession among all of the peoples. For all the earth is mine. You shall be a kingdom to me, a priest and a holy nation." And that's the point of God calling them there. They will literally be where everybody drives through to get to someplace else. Junction, Texas, for instance. All right, so Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So after being told to fill the earth in 9:7, we see that the earth is indeed filled. Japheth, 10:5, this is, from these, the coastlands of the nations were separated into their lands, everyone according to his language, according to their families, and into their nations. Ham, in 10:20, these are the sons of Ham according to their families, according to their languages, by their lands, by their nations. And then, of course, we get the same thing for Shem. These are the sons of Shem according to their families, according to their languages, by their lands, according to their nations. So from this perspective, we know what? That command, fill the earth, has in fact happened. Now, we're just spending a few moments here looking at chapter 10, because otherwise it's fairly simple and redundant. But what happens in chapter 10 is we're obviously spending much more time on Shem and Ham, because they are the blessed and cursed sons. Japheth doesn't get as much weight, and you'll see that as we look at the colophons, or when we just went through the colophons there, you see that they're a bit different. So two words are used here, Benay and Yalad. Benay means the sons of, pointing to the ancestor. Yalad means to beget, points to the descendants, right? And in the line of Japheth, only Benay is used. Shem and Ham both are used, because again, they're going to tie back to the son of promise and the cursed son. The first term gives us the beginning, the second, the continuing results. And so his lines, Shem and Ham's, are more fully developed, and of course they're going to be more interesting to Israel than Japheth's line. Israel will descend from Shem, they will then battle, by and large, Ham's descendants. So, every one of these, again, the names used in this section include tribes, cities, inhabitants of those cities, countries, along with individuals. So you get this stuff where you get the IMs, these plural nouns, obviously I think representing tribes rather than individual sons. So you get, when we did the Nephilim is plural, they were the sons of Anak, but the Anak are called what? The Anakim, to again add in the plural form. So you see all that function happening there. Names of the Gentile endings, the Ites, the Jebusites, Amorites, Canaanites, etc., all again located in their area where they're going to be heading. Now again, for the people hearing this the first time, they're going to be what? Well, I know those people. Why? Because they've heard of them even from Egypt and whatnot, because they know that they're from this area originally. Places listed include Babylon, Erech, Akkad, etc. And so again, there's some very specific place names in here. Obviously, there are the individual names like Nimrod and whatnot. So each section has its own heading and a colophon. Colophon is that ending that we read. Those three verses that we read at the beginning are the colophons. That's the ending. How do you wrap this sucker up? And they just reiterate the emphasis of the section. Again, they're used a little bit differently, right? All of them have basically these elements: lands, language, families, and nations. Japheth goes land, language, families, nations in that specific order, primarily geographically, linguistically ordered. However, Shem and Ham have both families, language, lands, and nations, appealing more to the tribal designations, I think, because again, these are going to be tribal people. Israel is a tribal nation. They move through tribal people. And then again, we go back to this last summary statement in 1032. When it's all said and done, these are the families of the sons of Noah, according to their genealogies by their nations. Out of these, the nations were separated on the earth after the flood. So everything looks like what? Looks pretty good, right? They did what they were supposed to do, right? All the people are spread out across the face of the earth as God has desired. However, did that happen because of obedience?
And all are at peace.
All are at peace, right? Probably not. Given that we didn't have two brothers at peace in chapter 5, so, for a 4, it's probably not at peace. But
Looks
again,
orderly on the surface.
it does look good, right? Though it looks orderly, everything's nice and laid out, blah, blah, blah. And again, everything's good. Again, I don't think it's part of a part of obedience. It's definitely more on the disobedience side of the house. So we get to chapter 11. And if somebody would just read through chapter 11 for us real quick, we'll start with that and lay that foundation, and then dive into this. You're not reading for anything, are you? You're the only person in class.
Make her read.
I'd love to. Scott.
I'll do it.
Wow.
So enthusiastic. The whole chapter.
The whole
Okay.
By the way, this is the shortest chapter of the book of Genesis.
All right. Now the whole earth had the same language and the same words, and it happened as they journeyed east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. Then they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone, and they had tar and mortar for mortar. And they said, Come, let us build for ourselves a city, and a tower whose top will reach into the heaven, and let us make for ourselves a name, lest we be scattered over the face of the whole earth. Then Yahweh came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. And Yahweh said, Behold, they are one people, and they all have the same language, and this is what they have begun to do. So now, nothing which they purpose to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language, so that they will not understand one another's language. So Yahweh scattered them from there over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. Therefore, its name was called Babel, because there Yahweh confused the language of the whole earth, and from there Yahweh scattered them over the face of the whole earth. These are the generations.
You can stop right there.
Okay.
Just that section. So that's it. That's the story. Tower of Babel, right? We've all heard it many, many times, right? And so again, we get the chapter 10 describing the different families of theirs. Chapter 11, I think, describes how that occurred, right? Man again is pictured as being what? Rebellious, right? And thus under the hand of God for discipline. So we're going to spend some time looking at this again. The people united by one language resolved to go off and build a tower. Interestingly enough, in these 9 verses, we have another chiasm, right? There is unity. At the end of the story, there's now what? They settle in Shinar, they are now what? Scattered. They plan and prepare materials. God then does what? Plans and prepares a curse. They're going to build a great city and a tower. They built a great city and a tower. They desire a name and to be unified. The people are unified, unfortunately, for evil. And then in the middle, the Lord comes down to see. And again, it's this great picture because, again, we tend to read this to sit there and say, we're going to build this thing to the heavens, right? And God has to leave the heavens in order to go and see this thing. You can almost imagine putting on his readers. Where is this great thing that you got off and built, right?
So God's over 40?
He's over 40. He's at least 40, right? So, and again, the fun thing about this, right, is you have to remember the Bible has basically 2 forms of humor, sarcasm and irony, right? Sarcasm. So, overweening pride, right? What does that mean? Someone who is arrogant and excessively proud. It's also used to describe quantities or qualities or desires that are seen as excessive, such as ambition and greed. Of course, the common interpretation of this section of scripture is what? The builders are trying to storm the heavens, right? They are guilty of the gross sin of pride, not fulfilling the command of God to fill the earth, which is actually from Genesis 1:28 and 9:1, both of them. Additionally, the interpretation is all of humanity is bunched together. I will go off and just listen to as I read through this. This is from a couple of commentaries that I actually use and I love, and I would absolutely recommend. Creation and Blessing, the book of Genesis by Alan P. Ross. The story concerns God's judgment on the sin of the Shinarites. Their major error was not the building of a city or a tower, but the attempt to unite and live in one place. Since this decision was open rebellion against God's original commission, 128, 9 and 1, their sin as well may be labeled hubris, that is, immense pride that leads to the disobedience of God.
Thomas, could it be their attempt to please God on their terms?
That's exactly what it's going to be. But we can just stop now and go lunch. But yeah, that's exactly where we're going with this. Should have saved that to the end, but that's okay. Yeah.
Stolen thunder.
No, it's not stolen. It's
Just
perfect,
the
but that's-
ziggurats had the thing on the top where the priest met the god, and then he went down the stairs. The god went down through a solid wall into the holy place in the temple to receive the sacrifice.
Which is exactly right. We're going to get there. Okay, so we'll have you stop before you give away anything else, right? But that's exactly right. The ziggurat is not where you worship God. You worship God where?
In the temple.
At the temple,
the
right?
foot of it.
So the ziggurat was meant to do what? It's a landing place, for lack of a better term, it's a landing zone. The Theological Dictionary of the Old Testament, and again another book that I have, theologically the building of the tower in Genesis 11 is interpreted as an act of human arrogance and rebellion against God. Accordingly, Yahweh intervenes against the builders and scatters them over the whole earth. This action of God is both punishment and preventative. It prevents men from going too far in their pride. Now again, I read these two things to you because this is how we're basically all taught. That at the end of the day, there are two sins. They did fill the earth, they all hung out together, and then it's just a great story of pride. And again, the problem is I don't think that we're capturing the cultural elements, like what a ziggurat is or what its purpose is, right? And so without these things, then unfortunately the story just becomes more metaphor and more of a, which is true of us, right? We're in rebellion, we like to overreach our limitations, etc., etc. All these things are true of us. However, I don't think that's the point of this story. I think there's some missing cultural elements that once we put them back in, will yield some different results. So, the Hebrew word balal, to mix, mingle, confuse, confound, is represented often as baffle or babble. So this is from Robert Alter, again, just a great author, but a non-Christian, by the way, so always be aware of that. But Balal is a polemic pun on the Akkadian Babel, which might actually mean gate of the god, back to where your point is going, right? As for the phonetic kingship of Babel, and Balal Webster's New World Dictionary from 1966, that's a good year, notes that
The year he was born.
Notes that a word like Babel occurs in a wide spectrum of languages, from Greek, Latin, Sanskrit to Norwegian, prudently concludes it's of oekic nature or origin, probably not a continuous derivation, but recoined from a common experience. That ending is going to be important to us as we move forward. But basically, Babel is kind of like an onomatopoeia. It's a word that sounds like what it sounds like, if that makes sense, okay? So, as we move forward with this, we talk about this, literary parallels, right? So if it's of a common origin, then we should see some common things, right? So concerning the architecture in particular, there are some significant correspondences to this. And this is from a text, this is from the book Ancient Near East Texts Relating to the Old Testament by James Pritchard. he basically goes off and talks through and just then records this statement from the Babylonians. When Marduk heard this, brightly glowed his features like the day. Construct Babylon, whose building you have requested. Let its brickwork be fashioned. You shall name it the sanctuary. The Anukai applied the implement for 1 whole year. They molded bricks. When the 2nd year arrived, they raised high the head of Escalia, equaling Apsu, which is a reference to the heavens. Having built a stage tower as high as the heavens, they set it up an abode for Marduk, Enlil, and Ea. These are 3 of their big gods. In their presence, he was seated in grandeur. Okay, this is their God who's now what? He has a place to come down and then make his grand entrance. Okay?
Isn't Marduk also Baal? Like I believe in.
Depends on
that story.
which culture you're talking about.
Okay.
But yeah, typically these things all end up getting, there's one at the top of the food chain. Right. So again, Alan Ross from his Creations and Blessings says, in fact, traditions from Mesopotamia record the ancient division of languages as well. The Sumerians have recorded that there was originally one language, since everyone came to worship Enlil with one tongue. So again, we see, I think, the purpose of the building in some of this extra biblical material. Genesis 11:4 is up here, but again, the Bible's humor is sarcasm and irony, right? And the people of Babel, Ham's children, want to make a name for themselves, okay? Now, I want to stop there for a second, because I think that's the other thing that we often do, is we basically assume what? It's everybody, all smushed together, right? Where do you see that where do you see this in these 9 verses?
I think we reason backward from the result where God scatters them and then they become the nation. So we just go backwards in reasoning and think, so all the nations were scrunched together.
That's exactly right. Exactly right. Which is another reason, honestly, I reason backward, and this is how I end up with triplets. I know, which is driving all of y'all nuts, right? But we never see that Noah and his wife have any more what? Children. So if you have 3 boys, and let's just say they're identical, does anybody have anything to gripe about?
Can you blame her though?
For her not wanting to have any more kids? She's 600 years old. I wouldn't want to have any
She's
more
already
kids.
had triplets at one time.
Yeah, natural birth triplets probably, right? So I mean, that's a tough, I'm like, we're done, right? So.
Hard to breastfeed.
Too much
Twins.
So there is one verse that might be construed as they're gathering together, which is 2, right? And it happened that they journeyed east and they found the plain, because the previous verse says they all had the same language. So verse 1 is talking about all people, and then the second verse says they traveled east and went to the plain of Shinar and settled there. So that maybe indicates that they were all moving to one place.
Yeah, it's possible, right? And so that's where we get the interpretation. However, it's not, in my mind, when I look at that, I'm going, I don't have to sit there and say
No,
that's
it's not
everybody.
conclusive. That's
It's not conclusive.
obviously a group did settle there.
And we get that from chapter 10.
Yeah.
Because we got what? It's Nimrod and all of his people, right? Who are in what line? Shem, Ham, or Japheth?
I would guess
Yeah.
that.
You would guess correctly, right? Because Ham's people are going to be a problem. All the way down the line, right? So it's Shem's, but what's funny about this whole thing is you kind of go through this, right? Again, if the biblical thing of humor is sarcasm, irony, here's what's interesting. I think it's Ham's children who are basically building the city and the tower, right? I can make some other evidence for that if I remember to later on. Ham's children want to make a name for themselves. What's interesting, it is Shem's descendant, Abraham, who Yahweh promises, I will make your name great. And what's even more hilarious about that, in Hebrew, Abram's forefather's name means name. What does Shem mean in Hebrew?
Name.
Name. Right? We want to make a great name for ourselves. You don't do that if your name is name. It's Ham who's going to go off and do what? He's already under a curse from his father. In my mind, he's going to go off and do what? It's him. It's his impulse to go off and try and do this, right?
But you also had an argument previously of what came first, the name or the meaning, right?
Mhm.
That could work here too.
Could absolutely work here too. You're exactly right.
Wow, Chad is listening.
I know, I love it, right? Okay,
Give him
So-
an aging
It's an
date.
ace.
He's still got it
It's an
for
old
another
star.
story.
I'm still chasing after another one.
Chasing the star, right?
Whole life. You've ruined it.
Chasing for the cocaine high of a gold star.
We're gonna have to sacrifice a cat on this.
That works. Just tell me where it went, right? So, all right. So here's the thing. I want to put all these up, and if you wouldn't mind, I want people to take each one of these. We'll read through these and just go through this because again, I want to make sure that we understand what happens here. Again, people make a name for themselves through anything that would cause them to be what?
Renowned, famous.
Remembered.
Known, yeah.
Yeah, exactly right. So again, making a name is a phrase that speaks of honor and an admirable reputation in the Old Testament. It's most often used of God, who's making a name for himself, right? So if I can have somebody read Isaiah 63:14 and then the next one, Nehemiah 9:10.
I could take Nehemiah.
Okay, go ahead and read Nehemiah if you got it, and then somebody else grab Isaiah.
Nehemiah 9:10, and show his signs and wonders upon Pharaoh and all his servants and all the people of his land, for thou knewest that they dealt proudly against them. So didst thou give thee a name as it is this day.
Yeah. So got him. So he does these things to do what? Get himself a name. Isaiah.
Like livestock that go down into the valley, the Spirit of the Lord gave them rest. That's A. So you led your people to make for yourself a glorious name.
There you go, making a glorious name, right? So of course, on occasion, God will then go off and make a name for somebody. So let's read Genesis 2:2, which we need to keep in our mind from this point forward, and then 2 Samuel 7:9.
Okay, Genesis.
You got Genesis? Let it rip.
It's the only book I have, so.
There you go.
And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing.
So again, in this case, this is God making Abraham great. Who's got 2 Samuel 7:9?
And I have been with you wherever you have gone, and have cut off all your enemies from before you. And I will make you a great name, like the names of the great men who are on the earth.
Exactly. So, and again, you can same thing is recorded in 1 Chronicles 7:18. So is this generally positive or negative? Making a name for somebody. Making a name for yourself, making a name for somebody, generally what?
Positive.
It's positive, right? In fact, I had a hard time finding anything that was negative. However, I'm not going to just simply sit there and say that it's not the case, but I have not found an instance where that's a bad thing. Ecclesiastes 2:16 and 17 says, "For just like the fool, there is no lasting remembrance of the wise, since in the days to come both will be forgotten." How is it that the wise person dies just like the fool? Therefore I hated life, because the work that was done under the sun was distressing to me. Everything is futile and a pursuit of the wind. Right? This verse leads us, I think, to our next point about making a name for oneself, right? Genesis 11 is the only time in Scripture where I think people are making a name for themselves. But again, it doesn't mean it's necessarily an inherently bad act, right? It's when we find other things, we find other information that we find that wanting to make a name for himself is actually kind of a good thing, right? Characterized by good deeds and great accomplishments. Go back to like the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Epic of Alana. These time period people, right, are about doing what? They did great deeds, they did accomplish great things for their people, and therefore they're remembered and immortalized in those ways, right? It's nothing bad about that. The most common way that people went off and made a name for themselves is to do what? Make more people, right? You have a lot of people, somebody's bound to remember you, right? You may have that one or two bad kids, but you've got 3 or 4 others, somebody's gonna think nicely of you, right? So,
Is this the case of, okay, you're triplets, right? You all get referred to as triplets. So somebody goes, how do I distinguish myself from these 2 other people that, you know what, I'm better than them?
exactly, especially if I'm under a curse. I'm just saying, I'm just putting together these little weird elements, right? There's just something about this, right? Now again, from this perspective, I'm just looking through this going, there's nothing bad about let's make a name for ourselves per se, right? So again, we get back into the who's us portion of this, right? So who are these people and where did they come from? Well, we go back to chapter 10, and as we're going through 10, 8 through 12, it tells us Cush fathered Nimrod, who was the first powerful man on earth. He was a powerful hunter in the sight of the Lord, and that is why it said, like Nimrod, a powerful hunter in the sight of the Lord. Redundant. His kingdom started with Babylon, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of what? Shinar. From that land he went to Assyria and built Nineveh, Rehoboth, Calah, and Resen between Nineveh and the great city Calah. So, again, as I look through all of that stuff, right, I sit there and say, is this all the people? And do we have to understand that this is literally everybody on the planet? I don't think so. I tend to think it's got to be Ham's descendants, right? Having read his curses and his lineage, mainly the enemies of Israel, we should probably expect bad things from these people, right? What I find interesting is Ham's descendants probably are the great builders of the ancient Near Eastern cultures, from Babylon to Egypt. So let's turn our attention to the desire not to scatter. And again, I don't think there's a lot of evidence in this. Genesis 1:28 is explicitly a blessing, and a blessing's hard to disobey because it carries no obligation. I hand you a gift. Are you obligated to open it? No. Right? Are you an idiot? Yes. Maybe. Right? But I mean, there's no obligation. You cannot be guilty of that from that perspective, right? Yes, it's grammatically an imperative. Go and fill the earth. However, filling the earth as a result clause indicates unlimited permission to be fruitful and multiply, right? Again, imperatives get used in lots of different ways.
Go enjoy yourselves.
Exactly, that's an imperative. On your honeymoon, how many of you were told, go have some fun? None of you took that to heart, right? You said, no, I'm not going to do that because they told me to, right? Imperatives do not necessarily mean they're commands from that perspective, right? Now, in Genesis 11, we have a group of people who obviously do not want to scatter, but that's not necessarily the same thing as not wanting to fill the earth, right? They are a family, and families tend to do what? Stay together, right? Stick together. There was this, Renee and I were watching this video, it was this very interesting note. It says, as a result of wars, poverty, and finally immigration to Wales, the result is that 80% of the original Welsh Italian population came from one small village near Parma called Bardi. Think about that. 80% of everybody who's of Welsh Italian descent all came from one small village. Why?
Multiply.
Huh?
They multiply.
No.
The family
Stay together.
groups.
They stayed together. One family member made it there and said, it doesn't stink. It's a lot better than Parma, right? You should come. And where did they all go? Same place, where everybody else was, right? They scattered, but they scattered as what? A unit, right? And again, if wanting to make a legacy, to have this desire for community, this reluctance to scatter are normal and unobjectionable, then we're left to go off and say, well, what's the point of the story? Tom's already given it to us, but nonetheless, that's the appeal to me, is because again, when you read through it, the things don't just automatically add up if you start to poke at the bits and pieces of it. So again, this is why I think it's important to understand where we are in the narrative. We showed this last time. We're going to show this probably when we get into Abraham again. But again, mankind has been doing what? Moving in the wrong direction, right? And we get to the bottom basically at Babel, and so Abraham represents sort of this lowest point. We've got to go off and sit there and say, where are we at? So I think the cultural elements are important. The tower is what any ancient Near East culture would call a ziggurat. Ziggurats were not built for people to ascend to heaven, but rather for gods to descend from heaven. Okay? That's the important part, is you got to understand the direction of that flow of the idea, right? It is a convenience by which the gods would make some grand entrance into the temple, which was always parked next door to the ziggurat. Okay? So I think this is, when we notice the chiasm of the 9 verses, what was the middle creamy filling? God came down, the Lord comes down to see.
Are you saying he came through the ziggurat?
I'm not saying he came through the ziggurat.
I do like how you tried to put words in his mouth.
I'm surprised you didn't show up for that.
But there's something to that, right? Because what they were trying to affect, God did anyways.
That's right, but that's the irony
Yeah.
and the sarcasm of
Yeah.
it, right? Exactly, that's right. So God,
If they pay attention to their history, he dwelt with them in the temple. I mean, there's
we're gonna get there.
countless historical that they just ignored.
Well, not for these people in Shinar. There's no temple, there's no tabernacle, because there's no Yahweh yet. But you're right, that's coming. We're gonna talk about a sacred space in just a second. All of you guys have read my notes. I gotta start putting a better password on my stuff. Anyway, so again, I don't think the people are aiming to make a name for themselves because of their pride. They're likely trying to do what? Make a name for themselves because of the way that they're going to capture the attention of a God who's going to come down and be worshipped. I think that's why God is displeased. Because what God are they talking about?
Not him.
Marduk, right? Probably some other god, right? And so if that's the case, then the question is, how does this apply to us and have meaning for us now? Because none of us, I can't find a single person in the United States per se who goes off and worships Marduk, Enlil, or any of these other people, right? So what are the sacred spaces in Genesis, Scott, to this point? Not the temple, not the tabernacle. Where's the one place that God has met man? Eden, exactly right. The garden, right? That's where we have God and man interacting with each other. And so the problem is what? The access to God was cut off by who? No, the angels with flaming swords, right? He's like, you were booted out, and by the way, you cannot come back, and here I'm going to post a couple of guards, right? Now the builders are launching an initiative to reestablish God's presence among themselves. I think that's the whole point of the ziggurat, right? And then Genesis 12 launches God's counter-initiative through a covenant given to Abraham. This is how he's going to reinitiate his contact with people, and it's going to, interestingly enough, be through a contract with somebody. So again, in the ancient Near East, and so if you ever see in my notes, ANE, I just decided one time to write it out, ANE, ancient Near East, worship consists of rituals designed to meet the supposed needs of gods, right? Gods had needs. They needed food, they needed housing, they needed clothing. And so the gods created people to meet these needs. I'm sorry, Scott is giggling over there, because it's goofy as a football bat, right? I need all these things, so what am I going to do? I'm going to create an entire other group of people to go off and do this for me. Well, then just create the food, the housing, and the shelter. Just be done with it, anyway.
They wanted attention.
They want attention, right? And so these religious practices are essentially defined as the care and feeding of the gods. Here's the important part. It is what?
Super pagan, because we're doing all this stuff to get God to jump or dance to our tune.
That's exactly right. This is why when we sit there and say you are acting like a pagan, it's because you're hitting on all of these kinds of notes here, right? It's first and foremost what? Transactional. That's if you're in a transactional relationship with God, you know you're involved in what? A pagan relationship. Because if I do this, you have to do that. That's how a transaction works, right? And of course, the people take care of the gods protect the people, and then pampered deities make for prosperous cities. This is in fact the argument that the Assyrians will make outside the gates of Jerusalem. Whose God is like our gods? By the way, pay attention, Hezekiah, everybody else has been defeated. Every other person's gods collapse like a house of cards. Yours will too. Why? Ours is working for us. Yours clearly stinks. And then, of course, Hezekiah does what? Goes to the temple, lays it all out for the God, says, hey, your great name is getting slandered. And God does what? Wipes out a couple 100,000 of them. End of story.
Well, it just goes to show that the prosperity gospel has been around a really long time.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. That's exactly what it is, right? So, you kind of pull all this together. This helps us see why the people of Genesis 11 believed that building the city with its tower would make a name for themselves. They would make a God beholden to them. They would flourish. Their fame would spread. They would be a people favored by a God. Where's the irony of that last statement?
They already were people favored by.
No, that's what's coming. When God calls Abraham, what's he going to be? What's he going to make Israel? A great nation favored by who?
Hell.
Yahweh, yeah. It's coming. Just on whose terms though? God's terms, not theirs. And that's the irony of this whole thing, right? So we go back to Genesis 12:2. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. The covenant is not premised on the idea that Yahweh has any needs, right? He offers the exact benefits to Abram that the gods offer to the ancient world. It's a one-for-one sort of a deal, right? But there's a big difference. This offer is not based on this codependent transactionalism. I need you to protect me, prosper me, flourish me. Oh, by the way, you need food, attention, and I don't know, water, whatever else that God needs, right? The idea that the covenant offers a completely different way of being in relationship with God. This is the important part that we're going to get with Abraham. So, the Babel then as a story reminds us that God has planned from the beginning to be with us, right? All the way from the idea of the garden. And so we need to have this Emmanuel theology that reflects his desire and our privilege. God wants to be with us. That is our privilege. His plans and purposes have always been to be in a relationship and to dwell with the people he has created, which is why the Bible climaxes with the New Jerusalem and sits there and says, we who are earth people built out of dirt will live with God on earth in his New Jerusalem, right? And so all this was initiated in the Garden of Eden, and I think is reflected in the purposes of the tabernacle and the temple, to your point, Scott, right? To sit there and say, that's the whole point. He dwells with us, not up in heaven, where he drags us up there, but he comes down and spends time with us. Of course, obviously, when Jesus shows up, it's a whole new thing. It's a whole brand new thing, right? Again, interesting enough, we always connect Pentecost with Babel, but that's really kind of the point of this, right? Is to sit there and say that even after the collapse, the failure of the kingdom project, what happens is that God sends everybody out from Jerusalem with God inside of them. The Spirit of God indwelling us. It's a complete reversal of Babel. And so in Revelation 21:3, I heard a loud voice from the throne. Look, God is dwelling with humanity, and he will live with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and will be their God. A total reversal of Babel. So, unfortunately, this story does what? It brings to end the common history of man. It is abrupt. It leaves the whole human race scattered helplessly across the earth. There is, in this case, no token of grace as before. Adam and Eve are not clothed. There's no person who walks with God and is no more. There's no rainbow at the end. The story just leaves you kind of sad and depressed, right? And so there has to be what? Some new history, some new beginning in some way, shape, or form. And so with that, I don't want you to feel bad, right? Because the story has a good ending, right? It feels like a little bit of that Princess Bride moment where you're all like, well, this is depressing, right? So I just want to make sure, there's some pictures of a bunny to kind of...
Very special bunny.
Very special bunny. Revive your soul, looking at that, isn't that lovely? Let's talk about some applications and principles, right? The Lord moves nations and controls the sweep of human history. That's pretty clear from this, right? So if you're the nation of Israel, do you need to worry about other nations as a result of hearing this story? Your answer should be what? No, right? Do you need the other nations? No, because that's going to literally be their international relational policy. Have nothing to do with the other nations. Why? Because you're my nation and nobody else is. Again, immorality still does not bring immortality. It's amazing. We'll try it again and again and again, but it never seems to work, right? How many of the great endeavors in church are focused on our glory and success rather than God's? I asked this to our elder board, because this is where things become too real, unfortunately, right?
Thomas, I know of at least 2 instances, churches we attended that made the comment that we need to teach other churches how to do church. And within a year or two, they were down.
They were down, yeah.
They were
Overweening pride.
humiliated. They were humiliated.
Yeah, exactly right.
So you said you asked the elders that question. What kind of answer did you get from that?
We had a long discussion. As I've got 2 ex-elders in here, you can imagine the kind of conversation that we have with something like this, right? Because again, you ask yourself, let's just pick on something specific. What kind of building do you need?
Do we need a new one?
Yeah, start with the condition of your old and the premise of a new one, or its location, or any other number of things, right? You can have a lot of conversations related to that. Again, how often do I attend to God on a transactional basis, meaning prayer, worship, and giving, instead of a relational one? Right?
Checking
You may
boxes.
not intend to it, but you sort of expect it.
Yeah.
Oh, I did all that. Why am I now not doing okay?
Yeah, exactly. Why is everything always bad happen to us? Right? Am I daily aware that he doesn't need my gifts, my attention, my prayers, my worship, my companionship? Think about that. Stop for the rest of this, right? Am I wrong in any of that?
No.
He is self-sufficient. Always has been, always will be. So what do I bring to the table?
Nothing.
And then I'm in his debt and he's not in mine? This is the lesson of the Tower of Babel. If you read it correctly, if you understand it for what it means, right?
Is it the heavens are my throne and the earth is my footstool? What kind of temple would you build for me?
Right, exactly. How could you do it? You have no chance whatsoever, right? To keep going, right? God's plans are accomplished with or without man's willingness. Again, that's why I love Acts chapters 3, 4, and 5. God looks like he suffers defeat again and again. The apostles look like they suffer defeat again and again. They keep getting thrown in jail. They keep getting censored, blah, blah, blah. And what happens? Thousands of people are saved. And what he tells everybody, Peter tells through his language and through his sermons, he sits there and said, you killed this guy because you wanted to, and it was exactly what God needed to have happen, because it's now an opportunity for you to be saved. And if you're Satan, you're like going, everything I do ends up being for him. How do you beat an enemy? Where your best move is exactly what he wanted you to do.
And he knew you were gonna do it before you did.
Exactly. The strongholds of culture are built upon anxiety and the desire for fame. This, I think, goes back to what? We've seen 2 lines in this story to this point through chapter 11, verse 9. We saw the line of Cain, and we saw the line of Seth, right? And Cain's line ends up with what? The people who make culture, right? Fashioning tools, fashioning musical instruments, blah, blah, blah. They're building cities. It's wonderful, right? Here we have 2 lines. In this case, we're going to follow the line of Shem and the line of Ham. Ham's people end up with what? They sound just like this group of people. Nimrod, a man of renown, who's building what? A large city, who will then go and found large empires, who will be a pain in the side of the Israelites for the rest of their lives, right? But again, all this idea for us too, we hold on to our culture because why? We think through it, we're significant.
You can still see the image of God in the cursed line because of their creativity.
Mm-hmm.
Like all of the things that come out are used for evil purposes, but yet they're beautiful things too.
That's right, yeah. I can't argue with like some of the great works of architecture or art or whatnot. And again, music that's unbelievable and yet not enriching, right?
Ham is still the thorn in their side. Hamas.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Which is a Hebrew word, by the way. You can look it up. It's actually in there as well. I wonder if they know that. Do I understand my true relationship with God? That I'm a what? Servant, doulos, a slave. Or do I continue to pretend that I'm an independent contractor? Again, do I understand I am called to give up my own desires and paths to follow him? His will be done, not mine. His kingdom come, not mine. I don't know why that's backwards, but I can't type. But that's the point. It's this idea, his will be done, not mine. His kingdom come, not mine. Do I understand the only successful path to a relationship with God comes through a covenant that he has established with me? This is the thing. I just need one book and I can give you the gospel, Genesis. I don't need the other 65. So when we read that Paul or Stephen or other people were arguing with the Jews about who Jesus was and why he was there, they didn't have to leave this. They didn't have to leave this book. And so even the Sadducees should have been able to see.
Really didn't want to.
They didn't want
Change. It went right back to your whole premise of who are we doing this for? They wanted the fame and prestige. They got the seats at the front of the temple. They got, you know, there's just so much of that it was gonna upset their way of life, their financial, I mean, everything.
everything. Exactly
There's
right.
no way they would be buying that if they wanted to maintain their position.
Yeah. What's more important, right? My soul or my position?
Well, we know what they were choosing.
They chose my position, right? Exactly. But they didn't see it that way.
I agree.
I think that's what's so shocking to me when you read the story of Lazarus coming out of the grave, that the Pharisees look and go, gosh, we gotta kill this guy.
He just raised the dead.
He just raised this
That's
dude from
gotta
the
be
dead. And we got, my first thought is I gotta kill him, right? It just tells you that's how we are. We're built that way, right?
It brings to mind the
Oops,
warning
went
that
too far.
Daniel gave to Nebuchadnezzar. He says, watch out. And what did Nebuchadnezzar do? He was out on his balcony. He says, look at what I have built.
Exactly.
And what happened?
Instantly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Nebuchadnezzar is a great character study in all this too, right? This last one. Languages are a monument to sin, which leads to the third act for today. What would the world look like? What would be the lasting effects if the Tower of Judgment, or if the judgment of the Tower of Babel was real? Well, I would think there's at least 4 things that come to my mind. Everyone would speak a different language. There would be different tribes and peoples and nations. But we would have common building techniques, and we would have a common history, even if it's only preserved in history. Now, Chinese language is one of the oldest languages on the planet, right? Scientists will tell us that the Homo sapiens have been running around the planet for 200,000 years. Language only goes back maybe 10,000. Which I find interesting. For 190,000 years, we just basically pointed and grunted at each other. Doesn't sound like we're very bright people, but then again, we're sheep. So let's look at some of the things that happen. Chinese is not a kind of their grammar is not like ours. It's again symbology, again like a hieroglyph would be for the Egyptians. So this is their pictogram for a large ship. It's made up of 3 others called an 8-person boat. Why would you pick that?
It's just scripted.
But why 8?
The flood.
Yeah, it would be
The common story.
the common story is the flood, right? That is the pictogram for create. The symbols are living, dust, and man. This is the symbol for a garden. Highlighting the arrows there, the symbols are enclosure with 4 rivers. This is the tempter, or I'm sorry, desire or covet. The symbols are 2 trees and a woman. This one, obviously tempter, covered devil and 2 trees. This is the word for sorrow. You won't believe this. Ancient weeds. Ancient weeds. The curse. Noah, his symbol, the man through whom the weed curse is removed. Isn't that wild? Again, one of the earliest written languages has all of the elements of Genesis 1 through 9 built into it. Now, we have this, right? We talked about this idea of a ziggurat, right? And so we're going to go through and talk. You guys can read through this, but we'll just think through this, right? As with any group in society today, let's just pick the group in this room, right? There are going to be a lot of people with a diverse set of ranges inside this room, right? Some are going to be builders, some are artists, some are going to tend to be more like farmers, agricultural, etc., etc. When God divided the people by their language, what was also divided, therefore? Knowledge groups, right? And so original groups that were probably became then the Egyptians or the Mayans or the Babylonians, obviously included people who knew what? They knew how to build, right? They're quite successful at it, right? Others lack that kind of knowledge, and so all of a sudden you're forced to migrate away. You can see yourself devolving into what? Agrarian. And your tools are stone or simpler than that, right?
Flint.
Yeah, because that's all you got. Because you don't know how to find ore, smelt it, and turn it into a plow. Because you don't have those skills, right? So it's not hard for us to find ourselves in this position where we can see every kind of thing that we find historically in groups of people from all over the place, right? Because again, what happened is all this thing blew apart. What's funny is evolutionary historians believe that each culture devised these same things independently, right? And what we find is all these same pyramids again and again and again. We're going to get into that specifically here in just a second. Now, this is a quote. There's no evidence whatever of any technological breakthrough in the methods of quarrying or cutting stone which might account for the onset of building pyramids. All the tools and techniques used by the pyramid builders were in existence well before their time. Meaning it just says what? Boom, it just shows up. How is that possible? Evolutionary wise, you'd assume what? Simpler forms to bigger, better things, and yet it just happens. I've got a couple of quotes from evolutionary people. Here's one. Archaeological evidence suggests that rather than developing slowly and painfully, as is normal with human societies, the civilization of ancient Egypt, like that of the Olmecs, emerged all at once and fully formed. That's my addition. Indeed, the period of transition from primitive to advanced society appears to have been so short, it makes no kind of historical sense. This is not a Christian writing this.
They just choose not to be completely stupid.
Well, he's being honest to a
I
point,
agree.
right? Yeah. Technological skills that should have taken hundreds or even thousands of years to evolve were brought into use almost overnight with no apparent antecedents whatsoever.
Aliens.
Aliens. How many times have you
Guaranteed that
flipped on
someone
at
would
10
say
o'clock
that's
at night
wrong.
in Discovery Channel and you see that weird dude with his aliens? Because why? They've got to have a way to account for the fact that these people built something out of nothing immediately, right? And again, here's another quote in here. One secular researcher observed the pyramid age had come to an end. This is talking about the plain of Giza, where the three large pyramids are out there, the largest being Cheops, right? The pyramid age had come to an end, having lasted for little more than a century. Now, pyramids were still being erected for about 1,000 years, but they rapidly became smaller and shoddier. And it's quite clear that with the third Giza pyramid, the zest for building pyramids was gone forever. So, building examples. Let's keep with this, right? I'm going to bring up three pyramids. The attached are the Great Pyramids of Xi'an. That's this model in there. I couldn't find one because it's been buried by silt over time. The Great Pyramids of Tenochtitlan, or I can't pronounce that. Teotihuacan in Mexico, and then the Great Pyramid in Egypt, the one in the tall one with a little bit of limestone cap still on it, right? Now these are all separated by thousands of miles of land and ocean. Three ancient civilizations should never have had any contact with each other, somehow managed to design, engineer, and build the same structure over and over again. Interestingly enough, they all basically are oriented on Orion's belt. This is why we keep coming back to the stellar things, right? Because if you look at Orion's belt, it's just 3 stars. And yet you can sit there and see the 3 pyramids in Giza basically or have that same orientation. Honestly, there's also 3 pyramids in Mexico with the same orientation. How? Doesn't make any dang sense, right? It gets even weirder, right? Additionally, right, of the largest, the one in Mexico has the exact same base, 750 by 750, and it's exactly half the height of the largest one in Egypt. Why? What's the math that sits there and says that's the biggest pyramid I could build? And on top of it,
Coincidence, I guess.
a coincidence, right? All of them are basically on what? Almost the same latitude. Notice that latitude cuts through what? Iraq. There's the plains of Shinar. Just a coincidence?
Maybe not.
Maybe not, right? Now, History. If the Bible story is true, people would carry with them common ideas, and again, these things would survive, even if there's sort of legends and stuff like this, right? This is just the elements of the story from the Bible. These are the cultures that have those elements that they pick up in some way, shape, or form. Full representation or partial representation. That's a lot of dang people who have the same story. Although no two cultures share the same constellations identical in every detail, there are deep and basic similarities that have obviously attracted the attention of secular researchers. Again, people who don't give any credence to Genesis 1 through 11. Again, thousands of stars available to the naked eye, possibility of independently evolving cultures arriving at the same constellations by random chance is seemingly remote. And yet, you have these really weird things that happen, right? There's no evolutionary approach that explains how different cultures, supposedly developing in different parts of the world, imagine the same or similar star patterns in the sky. Conversely, the existence of even a few identical constellations suggests that all men were concentrated at one point before all ethnic groups were blown apart. So you get this. This is the Babylonians identify Sirius. Okay, this is the constellation Sirius as part of a constellation which they describe as a bow and arrow. The Chinese independently describe a bow and arrow in the sky, but they use slightly different stars for their construction. For them, Sirius is part of an image at which the arrow is shooting, and curiously, the image at which the arrow is shooting is a dog. So again, they take what? Same ideas, just mix them a little bit. In the Western tradition, Sirius is part of the constellation, what? Canis Major, the big dog. See how we keep pulling these same elements together? How are the same images, dogs, bows, and arrows, occurring in the cosmographies of different cultures? Because all you see is what? A guy made of dots and lines.
I think it's especially compelling because none of the star constellations actually look like what they're said to depict.
Right.
I pick a lot of things.
I don't see a dog there, or a bow and arrow. But when Tom puts his big artistic rendering behind it, it's like, oh, I see it now. This one is hilarious to me, the Pleiades, which is again a subset of a larger constellation. Another one known worldwide in ancient times. Again, the Pleiades is referenced in the book of Job, all right? So even among Australian Aborigines. Now, in Aboriginal mythology, there are many stories of the Pleiades. They are given female attributes and are known as the Seven Sisters. In this, there is a pronounced similarity to legends from all over the world. What's mostly interesting about this is what? If you were to go off and take a look by naked eye, on the clearest of nights, and your eyes are fixed perfectly, how many stars would you see? You'd see 6. You and I have bad eyesight, so we would maybe see 1, right? So that's why I said if you had perfect eyesight, you would see what? You would see 6. The 7th is so dim as to be unseen, yet all over the world, among all civilized and savage races in Europe, India, China, Japan, America, Africa, this group is not merely regarded as 7 stars, but what is still more surprisingly, as the 7 stars. How do they know there are 7 stars there if you can't see them?
What's interesting, and I studied some comparative mythology years and years ago, and one of the reasonings they came up with was that, you know, the shared unconscious. So, you know, Jung's whole idea, look, we all just have this innate knowledge.
Yeah.
Which is even sillier than the notion of, it's much sillier than Babel.
Yeah, much sillier, because at least we have some connective reason for it, right? As opposed to we all sleep.
Just do it.
We all have share masculine, whatever it's called. I've got 2 more slides. We'll bang through them quickly. Again, this is the last one of importance. Again, we've talked about a 360-day calendar, as history shows, would inflict serious hardships on a society. Again, this is the thing. This is where I think all the original building of all the different parts, from the mines to Stonehenge to everywhere else, they're trying to figure out what happened to our, why is everything off all the time and getting worse every single year, every single cycle, right? And these cultures all share 360 days. There is a ton of notes in here on this, and I would absolutely have you go off and take a look at it. But again, one of the other things that Newton points out is to sit there and say, where in the world did we come up with 360 degrees in the ecliptic? Why do we call a circle 360 degrees? How did we pick that number? Because it's what? It's 1 year. It's a full orbit around the sun. So again, all of this stuff comes together, and I think it highlights the fact that Babel is a real story, not mythology. So we're going to go off next week, and we're going to do the rest of chapter 11, 10 through 26, but quick, that moves quick, and then we're going to move into Abraham, and I can't believe I got all done with 2 minutes over. So, all right. No time for questions. We're going to turn off, and then we'll talk after.